Perhaps the great paradox of life is that we don't really know how to live it until we realize it's coming to an end. In fact, I often say that death is life's greatest teacher because really it brings everything into focus of like what matters, who matters, how should I live in order to maximize my quality of life. And that's what this video is about. I'm going to talk about a couple experiences I've had with death, but also reference this book, Untethered Soul by Michael Singer. And in this chapter, there's a chapter in here called Contemplating Death, which is one of the few chapters I have bookmarked in all my books that I come back to and read with a lot of frequency. So this video is going to tell you about the connection between death and happiness, particularly how experiencing or contemplating death can help us to live happier lives. So I had a couple near-death experiences this year that I felt like put things into perspective. The first, we were on this little prop plane, like a 3-person plane. And we were flying across the state, and it was, it's super bumpy, it's super choppy. If you've ever ridden in a plane, like a tiny one, imagine being in like a normal plane, except it's like literally just like you and one other person. And so all those little bumps and all that stuff, like feels like you're just hanging in the air on your own. I don't know, it's a weird experience. So we did that, and we flew to our place, came back. The next morning, our friend who was the pilot went to start the plane and put it through like its test to take off before you take off, and the engine failed. It couldn't even take off. And so I was like, all right, that's interesting that we flew across the state and back in that plane, and the next day the engine essentially failed, and it's now been like 4 months and the plane's still sitting in that hangar, I'm pretty sure. Then I had one actually just the other day. We were at a trip in the Virgin Islands. We were out on this like rocky cliff outcropping thing by this tidal pool, and we were all playing around there, and all of a sudden the waves got really big, and one wave just came in, wiped us all out. I was good. I hung onto a rock, but 2 of my best friends got basically swept away across all these really sharp rocks and thrown into a big puddle of water. And one of them was like covered in blood and all scraped up and might have broken his toe. But thankfully they were okay. But the crazy part of that is as we were leaving that area, we found this big stack of like rocks and seashells with a cross and a memorial on it. And then that night at dinner, the waiter who lived on the island like looked at my friend and he was like, "Oh, did you go to the tidal pool?" And he was like, "Yeah, you're lucky you made it back." So in both of these experiences, and every time I take the time to contemplate death, not in like a scared, morbid way, but just acknowledge that I am getting older and death is inevitable and it could happen at any moment. Oftentimes you're driving along, you take a breath in and you don't realize you didn't take another one. You're doing your thing, you're eating dinner, and then that's it. You go to bed and never wake up. And while that sounds really negative and scary, for me, I feel like it often helps bring things into perspective when I think about how I'm living my life, how I'm spending my time and how I'm dedicating both my time, but also like my emotional energy and my focus. And that's a great segue to talk about, again, the chapter in this book, which one of my favorite books, highly recommend it. And he says a few things, right? Basically says that death will challenge you to live at your highest level. Because, really think about it. Like, we can get so complacent, and not complacent when it comes to achievement, but complacent in the sense of like, how do we treat our loved ones, right? We can be kind of callous towards our parents or our significant other or even our kids, right? We're not being mean to them, but we just kind of get used to them and we don't really think anything of it. We can think about it in terms of what we let bother us, right? It's like, think of these little things that just frustrate you and bother you. And if you knew this was the last month of your life, for instance, or even the last year of your life, how might that change? And then it just begs the question of like, honestly think for a second, and this is an exercise he takes through in the book, of how would you live if you knew your life was coming to an end? If you knew this was the last time you're going to get to walk outside, or even if you just ran into a stranger and you were talking to them and you realized that this was the last person you'd ever get to interact with, how might that change? And I think that's the important part, is how, not the what. Because you can get so wrapped up in the what, which is like, oh, if I knew I was dying this 6 months from now, I would just start doing every drug I can and I would spend all my money and I would travel the world. It's like, okay, that's maybe fair. But the question is not what, but it's how. If you knew your life was coming to an end a year from now, how would you live in your daily life, right? How would you eat your meals? How would you interact with your loved ones? How would you interact with even strangers? How would you approach each moment with that level of intention and attention? And why can't we live that way right now? So again, it's not so much the what, but the how. Not what we're doing and experiencing, but how we are experiencing it with that level of intensity and intention and attention to the present moment. So every time I do this exercise, again, I think it's really powerful. And it's not something to be like depressed or morbid, but I try to contemplate that death could happen at any moment. I don't know when it's going to happen, and that I'm getting older every single day, right? Basically, every day is one step closer to death. That's just facts. And every time I do this, pretty much without fail, it helps me to prioritize first, right? What matters? Who matters? How should I be spending my time? And then it helps me to think about how I should engage in the world, right? Like, how am I going to approach these just normal morning here, my cup of coffee, my lunch? All of those things helps me to experience them in a way that's much more rich and much more vivid. So I hope this video is helpful. I shared a couple stories about experiencing death, as well as, again, this great work by Michael Singer. I'll include some resources down below. Here's a video that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. So again, I encourage you to contemplate death, face death, live close to death. My favorite quote in this book, he says something to the effect of, the wise person or the enlightened person lives as though a sword were suspended above their head by a spider's thread. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. This has been your happiness nerd, Jackson Kirchis.